thank you to all my colleagues. I think this is a fantastic opportunity to work together, because I think the approach of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research is something that's fundamental to make progress on disaster research. I think as COVID-19, as we've seen the complexity of COVID-19, for example, wearing face mask, it's not only about how thick the pores are, how much of virus can pass through that linen that you have against your face, but also what do you do if you wear it? Do you start getting too close to other people? Do you take it off and put it in your pocket? There are so many factors that needs to be factored in to understand the overall use, and it will vary according to context. Today's topic is on myths, and I think it's for me it's a very interesting topic, because I think myths fill a number of different roles. I think in many places where I've been working, they are somehow an explanation, somehow fatalistic. I remember working in Pakistan after the big earthquake in 2005. And a lot of the people I met who lost property and relatives, they were saying we were punished because we did not pray good enough. So they sort of found an explanation in a fatalistic view, and the myth that when God is upset with you, the earth will tremble and you will be punished. I think, you know, in historical terms, this has been an adequate way of relating to unexplainable events happening and also make sense somehow. However, I think in a more modern society, myths can also be dangerous. And I'm thinking here about fake news, alternative facts. And I think science has an important role here to try to somehow bring some facts to the table, especially when responding to disasters. So my talk will be in relation to how do we respond to these calamities that we have been listened to that all around the world happen, even though, as Johan was saying, to a bit of a lesser extent than maybe what we thought. It's not been increasing in the way that is being portrayed as a myth. But actually the last 20 years, the number of disasters actually dropped a bit, and also the number of people dying from disasters. But as Margareta was highlighting, what do we mean by death from a disaster? And we can hear that on COVID-19 when we talk about death. Is it because of, or is it in combination that you die from COVID? Is it due to it, or is it because you have a lot of other conditions as well? So it is a very difficult topic, and also what was addressed, maybe it's not so interesting to understand how many people die, but from my side, it's more interesting to understand how many are left out there and need some sort of assistance after the disaster struck. So at Karolinska Institute, I lead as the Center for Research on Healthcare in Disasters, where we try to understand better how to respond to disasters. And we are a World Health Organization collaborating center, where we try to assist WHO to bring more knowledge into the response, and also primarily how to coordinate international assistance following disasters. Well, these images, you have all seen them, and somehow we react instantaneously. There's some sort of humanitarian imperative when we see these images, is that we want to help. And I think that's one dimension of actually being human, that we want to do something. But what to do and how to do it while thinking is important. Because I think traditionally it's been a rapid response, filling up aeroplanes, going to the disaster zone, bringing doctors, preferably surgeons. I'm a general surgeon myself, so I can, put the blame a bit on the surgeons, but also bringing medications and stuff. It's a lot of doing something is to be active, but also bringing supplies. But the question is whether that is the right approach, or if you could tailor fit that more. And I had the opportunity to have Hans Rosling as my PhD supervisor, and he really forced me to think and really don't act too much on your emotions. You must also you. And I can always hear his voice at the back of my head. And for example, this is an old graph from the Pan American Health Organization, where they compiled how different types of natural disasters affect health. And coming back to dying from a disease or from a disaster, that some of the effects of a disaster are direct effects. And if we look, for example, on natural disasters and different types of hazards, earthquakes, strong winds, tsunamis, ordinary floods, landslides, we can see that the direct effects on health is high for following earthquakes, meaning we will have a lot of injured. Strong winds, we have moderate direct effects, meaning also primarily injured. For the rest, quite a low direct effects on health, meaning that very few injured from tsunamis, ordinary floods, and landslides. While it's primarily the indirect effects that are a problem for health, meaning that people get displaced, they lose their house, people need to cramp up in small living areas, maybe under plastic sheeting, where they don't have access to safe water, where the latrines are a problem. There might be problems with food, security, and access to some sort of healthcare for the normal burden of disease. So that tends to be overall one of the primarily effects of natural disasters, the indirect effects. We are now engaged in collaboration with Uppsala Peace and Conflict Research, where we're looking on the health effects of conflict. And it seems like it's around 10 to 15 times more health effects also in terms of mortality, that the indirects really, they are the biggest problem. So if we are going to respond to help people, we need to put the indirect effects in the focus. Maybe not so much direct effects, except maybe for earthquakes where we will have a lot of injured. For the rest, we need to look on public health in general. So disasters, as you all know, by definition, it means that there's lack of resources. So that needs to be taken into account, meaning that you need to really prioritize what you do. And some of the principles is that rather than to be, let's say, just everything for everybody, it has to be needs-based. You need to define what are the main needs of this population, or rather to say what are the main risks for this population that needs to be addressed. And it also needs to be context adapted, meaning that you need to take into account vulnerability, preparedness, and also the resilience of the population. So to have that as part of your planning your response. You will have to have a specific way of working, meaning that you have a no regrets policy, meaning that you can't think too much, you need to act, which means that you also quite have a fairly set rules of engagement, because you don't have the normal time to really to ask the population for exactly how they want things, etc. But you have to act because time is short. It also requires strict prioritizations, meaning that we can't do everything. So you need to have a list of what you want to focus on. And here, the term empiric risk, meaning that what is our experience of risk that the populations are exposed to, and to focus your intervention based on that rather than on these myths. But a problem we have is that we have this very limited systematic research done in disaster, because first of all, very difficult to do a randomized control study and say, okay, we will help this group and we will not help this other group. Ethical issues, time issues, and also the whole context of insecurity and chaos. So it's not really optimal to conduct research. So it's usually a lot of retrospective data that we have to base our studies on. And you could say, because of this humanitarian imperative, because the sort of good values of international assistance, it's not really been scrutinized in a way that maybe it should be, because we have a priori accepted it to be good. So that I think is now a bit being challenged. So one of my myths are which also Margareta highlighted, are in relation to epidemics and dead bodies. I think almost every time there's been a tsunami or a typhoon or earthquake, there is this myth now there will be epidemics, and also the dead bodies must immediately be buried in mass graves, otherwise we will have epidemics because of these dead bodies. That is actually not true as we know it. That dead bodies actually do not spread diseases, and I think this has a very clear answer, meaning that you know, a dead body, a virus cannot multiply inside the dead body, and most of the dead bodies following a tsunami or an earthquake, they don't have any specific disease to spread. They are just like any human being. In cholera or Ebola and maybe COVID, maybe you need to take more of precautions. However, we have not found that this is a really big problem with the dead bodies, but probably more precautions should have been taken. So that's important to remember. And the risk of communicable diseases following disaster is, as I said, it's mainly related to crowding and lack of hygiene, not to the actual disaster, not even flooding. And you could probably imagine that maybe you know, we could think that there would be bacteria and viruses in the water. However, it will be extremely diluted, and there are studies done even close to water cleaning plants, and even during flooding, they haven't found a large of water being infected with a lot of pathogens. So actually, even though during flooding, it is not a big problem with that direct effects, but the indirect effects, meaning access to safe water and hygiene, that is the main problem. And we have not recorded any major epidemic following natural disasters. You may record that there was a cholera outbreak in Haiti 2010. That was not due to the earthquake, that was due to deployment of foreign UN soldiers that brought the cholera to Haiti, which was before not very badly affected by cholera. And there have been several studies on this, obviously, but as I said, the evidence is a bit not so strong. And of course, there's WHO guidelines on how to manage based on this, but still we hear that myth coming back regularly. Another myth I would like to highlight is this idea of that international field hospitals must be sent immediately. As I was highlighting initially, there may be need following earthquakes. Otherwise, the need for trauma surgeons is very limited. This is an illustration of why it is during earthquakes. If you take the 5 last big earthquakes we've had in the world and you divide the proportion of dead and injured, the size of the square is the number of people. So you can see Haiti, it's quite a big square because there was a lot of people affected. This is data from the Center of Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters in Belgium. So basically what we can see that the green area is for surgeons for managing. So while the red one is the undertaker. So you can see there's a lot of green area in these earthquakes, a lot of work for the surgeons, or mainly rather the orthopedic surgeon, because we know 70% of these, the green area is fractures and fracture management. If we look on tsunamis, it is the opposite. It's more job for the undertaker than for the surgeon. So, and also these injuries are quite limited. They are not severe because if you end up in the water of the tsunami, you will die. But if you manage to escape, you will escape, but with quite minor injuries. So this is what it looks like. So that this is why we don't need to send a trauma surgeon following a tsunami. Debunking it that trauma surgical hospitals may be needed following strong earthquakes, but again, it needs to be context dependent. And also what I like to highlight is that that these field hospitals, they should primarily focus on covering the normal diseases, such as pregnancies, childhood fever, etc., because that would be the main need very quickly within 10 to 14 days. The majority of conditions presented also after an earthquake will be related to the normal burden of disease. So we shouldn't over-focus on the trauma. Thank you.